What if everything you thought you knew about learning in the Middle Ages was completely wrong? What if the institutions we often see as rigid and old-fashioned were actually the secret powerhouses behind European thought, from roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE? What if the medieval church, often painted as a suppressor of knowledge, was actually the architect of Europe's entire educational landscape? Number 9. The church protected ancient knowledge from disappearing forever. Imagine a world plunging into chaos. The mighty Roman Empire, once a beacon of order and learning, fractured. Cities crumbled, trade routes vanished, and the very idea of organized education seemed to flicker and die. Books, those precious scrolls and codices, filled with the wisdom of Greece and Rome, faced a perilous future. They could be lost to neglect, fire, or the simple apathy of a disrupted world. But in this era of upheaval, one institution remained stubbornly persistent, a network of communities stretching across the continent, the medieval church. It was within the quiet walls of monasteries, places dedicated to prayer and contemplation, that the most vital act of academic preservation unfolded. Monks, living by strict rules like the rule of Saint Benedict, saw the copying of texts not just as a duty, but as a sacred act, a way to serve God and perpetuate knowledge. They became the unsung guardians of civilization's written heritage. Think about the scriptoria, those dedicated rooms in monasteries where silence reigned, broken only by the scratch of quill on parchment. These were not just quiet libraries. They were buzzing workshops of intellectual labor. Day after day, year after year, monks hunched over desks, their fingers stained with ink, painstakingly reproducing manuscripts. They copied everything. Yes, they copied religious texts like the Bible and the writings of early church fathers, but they also copied the works of Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, and Horace. They preserved the medical treatises of Hippocrates and Galen, the mathematical theories of Euclid, and the astronomical observations of Ptolemy. Without their tireless efforts, much of the classical literature and scientific understanding we have today would have been lost to the dustbin of history. The texts were not always perfectly copied. Sometimes, a tired monk might misspell a word or skip a line, leading to small errors that scholars today meticulously track. But the overwhelming dedication to the task was unwavering. Consider the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, founded by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century. It became a powerhouse of scholarship, a center where texts were not only copied, but also studied and discussed. The library at Monte Cassino housed an incredible collection, and its scriptorium produced countless books, ensuring the survival of Latin literature through generations. Far to the north, in places like the Abbey of St. Gall in modern-day Switzerland, similar scenes unfolded. The monks there developed distinctive script styles and intricate illuminations, making their manuscripts not just functional, but also beautiful works of art. The very act of writing and illustrating kept alive a highly sophisticated set of skills, from preparing parchment out of animal skins to grinding pigments for vibrant colors. This preservation was not just about hoarding old books. It was about creating a continuous chain of intellectual transmission. When a text was copied, it was not merely recatate. It was, in a sense, reactivated. It meant that future generations would have access to the arguments, stories, and scientific data contained within those pages. Libraries within these monasteries, often modest by modern standards, were nevertheless crucial repositories, places where scholars, even centuries later, could access a vast collection of knowledge. Figures like Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman who founded the Vivarium monastery in the 6th century, explicitly instructed his monks to copy texts, recognizing the profound importance of this work for both spiritual and intellectual life. He understood that preserving these books was paramount for the future of learning itself. The process was slow, painstaking, and immensely costly. Parchment was expensive. Quills had to be cut just right and ink carefully mixed. A single book could take months, even years, to complete. Yet, the Church poured resources into this endeavor, understanding that knowledge was a treasure to be protected and disseminated. These preserved texts became the foundation upon which later intellectual revivals, including the Carolingian Renaissance and ultimately the High Middle Ages, would build. When Charlemagne, in the 8th and 9th centuries, sought to revitalize education across his empire, he turned directly to monastic communities, urging them to improve their copying practices and expand their libraries. He knew that the intellectual bedrock of his nascent empire depended on the preservation of these very works. The monasteries were not just isolated islands. They were connected by a flow of texts and ideas, with books being lent, exchanged, and copied across different regions, creating a kind of intellectual network. This dedication ensured that the light of learning, however dim it might have appeared at times, never entirely went out. The silent scribes, with their patient hands and unwavering focus, laid the groundwork for everything that came after, providing the literal pages upon which European learning would continue to unfold. Number 8. The Church created Europe's first universities. Before the grand universities we recognize today, before students argued complex ideas in lecture halls, Europe's education system was a patchwork of monastic and cathedral schools. These were places where individuals might learn basic Latin, some arithmetic, or delve into religious texts. But as Europe began to stabilize after centuries of upheaval, as towns grew and trade expanded, a new kind of intellectual hunger emerged. People sought more advanced, more specialized knowledge. And it was out of this evolving landscape that the medieval university, an entirely new invention in Europe, began to take shape, largely under the direct influence and guidance of the Church. These weren't established by royal decree or state funding in the way modern universities are. They sprang organically from existing church schools and coalesced into formal institutions recognized and protected by the highest ecclesiastical authorities. Think about Bologna in Italy, often considered the first true university in Europe. It didn't start with a blueprint. It began with groups of students, eager to learn law, gathering around respected masters. These masters, often clerics themselves, taught Roman law and, crucially, canon law, the law of the Church. Students, many of whom were adults traveling from afar, formed nations or guilds not unlike craft guilds, to protect their interests from local townspeople and to manage their own affairs. They hired the masters, paid their fees, and even set the curriculum. The Church, seeing the utility and intellectual ferment in these gatherings, quickly stepped in. Popes and bishops issued papal bulls and charters that granted these nascent institutions special privileges. They offered protections to students and masters, often classifying them as clerics, which meant they were exempt from local secular laws and subject instead to church courts. This special status was a massive incentive, attracting scholars from across Europe. Across the Alps in Paris, another great university formed, this one specializing in theology. It grew out of the cathedral schools surrounding Notre Dame. Masters and students congregated in the Latin Quarter, developing sophisticated methods of theological debate and inquiry. The University of Paris became the intellectual heart of Christian Europe, a place where the most brilliant minds wrestled with the deepest questions of faith and reason. Popes like Innocent III and Gregory IX played pivotal roles in formalizing its structure, issuing statutes that defined faculties, established procedures for granting degrees, and settled disputes between the masters and the Bishop of Paris. These papal interventions were not just about control. They were about legitimizing these new centers of learning and ensuring their academic freedom from arbitrary local interference. The Church understood that a vibrant intellectual life was essential for its own mission and for the wider society. Oxford and Cambridge in England followed similar patterns, growing out of communities of scholars, attracting royal and ecclesiastical patronage, and eventually receiving papal recognition. These universities developed into self-governing corporations of masters and scholars distinct from the local town, often with their own courts and privileges. The curriculum was often standardized, beginning with the liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, before students could progress to higher faculties like theology, law, or medicine. Church's influence was undeniable in shaping this curriculum, particularly the preeminence of theology as the queen of the sciences. The students themselves were often clerics, or destined for careers in the church or in church administration. The language of instruction was Latin, which meant that a scholar trained in Bologna could easily move to Paris or Oxford and continue their studies or teaching without a language barrier. This created an international intellectual community, a network of scholars and ideas that transcended national boundaries. Popes would often intervene to protect scholars, to mediate disputes between students and townspeople, or to ensure that university charters were respected. They saw the universities as vital intellectual engines for the entire Christian world. The academic structure that emerged from these medieval universities, shaped so significantly by the Church, is still recognizable today. Concept of faculties, degrees, bachelor, master, doctor, public lectures, and formal disputations all have their roots in these early institutions. These universities became hotbeds of intellectual debate, where new ideas were discussed, challenged, and refined. They produced not just theologians and lawyers, but also physicians, astronomers, and philosophers. Church's direct support, legal protection, and financial backing allowed these fragile intellectual communities to flourish, transforming them from informal gatherings into enduring institutions that would shape European thought for centuries. They were not just places of learning. They were vibrant, sometimes turbulent, centers of intellectual innovation, nurtured and protected by the very institution, often misjudged as antithetical to progress. Number 7. The Church drove rigorous theological inquiry. For some, the medieval Church might seem like an institution that simply dictated beliefs, leaving no room for questions or debate. But a closer look reveals a powerful, often intense, intellectual engine at its heart: scholasticism. This wasn't just about blindly accepting dogma. It was about using the sharpest tools of logic and reason to understand and articulate theological truths. It was a rigorous, systematic, and often incredibly complicated intellectual quest, driven by the desire to reconcile faith with the philosophical heritage of the ancient world. This intellectual endeavor profoundly shaped the very methods of inquiry and argumentation that spread throughout European learning. Think about Peter Abelard in the 12th century, a brilliant and controversial figure whose work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, laid some of the groundwork for scholastic method. In this book, Abelard presented contradictory statements from different church authorities and then invited readers to use reason and dialectic to resolve the apparent discrepancies. This was not an attempt to undermine faith, but to deepen understanding by engaging with difficult questions head-on. This approach encouraged critical thinking and the systematic examination of sources. It showed that even within the realm of sacred texts, rigorous analysis was not only permissible but necessary. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works in Latin translation, particularly his treatises on logic, metaphysics, and ethics, truly ignited the scholastic fire. For medieval scholars, Aristotle presented a monumental challenge and an incredible opportunity. His philosophy was systematic, rational, and explored a vast range of natural phenomena. But it wasn't Christian. The central intellectual project of many scholastic thinkers, especially in the 13th century, became the integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. This was an enormous task, requiring immense intellectual prowess and a commitment to detailed logical argumentation. The most famous figure in this endeavor was Thomas Aquinas. His Summa Theologica is not just a theological treatise. It is a monumental work of systematic thought, a towering example of scholastic method. Aquinas would pose a question, often a challenging one, then present arguments against his position followed by arguments for it, and finally, his own detailed resolution, meticulously supported by logic and references to scripture, church fathers, and philosophers. This structured approach, moving from problem to objections to resolution, became a hallmark of medieval intellectual life. It taught scholars how to analyze complex issues, how to construct compelling arguments, and how to anticipate and refute counterarguments. It was, in essence, a master class in critical thinking and systematic reasoning. Disputations were a central feature of university life, especially in faculties of theology. These were public debates, often highly formalized, where masters and students would argue specific questiones or questions. One scholar would propose a thesis, another would offer objections, and the first would then defend their position. These were not simply shouting matches, they were exercises in logical precision, rhetorical skill, and intellectual stamina. Imagine the intellectual atmosphere in Paris, with scholars from across Europe engaging in these demanding contests of wit and argument. The pressure to articulate one's ideas clearly and defend them logically was immense, shaping generations of thinkers. This intense focus on logic and dialectic wasn't confined to theology. The methods developed in theological debates, the systematic presentation of arguments, the careful definition of terms, the rigorous application of reason spilled over into other fields of study. Law, medicine, and even early scientific investigations began to adopt similar structured approaches to inquiry. The pursuit of theological understanding, therefore, fostered an intellectual rigor that permeated all areas of European learning. It taught scholars how to organize knowledge, how to build coherent systems of thought, and how to engage in sustained, rational debate. The Church, by valuing this deep intellectual engagement with its own core beliefs, inadvertently laid the groundwork for a mode of inquiry that would become fundamental to Western intellectual tradition. It showed that even the most profound truths could be approached through reason, through rigorous questioning, and through a commitment to intellectual clarity. Number 6. The Church provided widespread patronage for arts and sciences. When you think about who funded great projects and scholars in the medieval era, the answer often points overwhelmingly to the Church. It wasn't just about building magnificent cathedrals. The Church was the single wealthiest and most pervasive institution in medieval Europe, and its vast resources were frequently channeled into intellectual and artistic pursuits, often acting as the primary patron for what we would now call scientific and artistic endeavors. This patronage directly shaped what kind of knowledge was pursued, what magnificent structures were built, and which thinkers received support. Consider the construction of cathedrals, those towering Gothic masterpieces that still inspire awe today. These were not just places of worship. They were immense engineering projects. Building them required sophisticated knowledge of geometry, mathematics, physics, and architecture. Master masons and their teams, often employed directly or indirectly by the Church, pushed the boundaries of structural design, developing techniques like flying buttresses and ribbed vaults that allowed for unprecedented height and light. The sheer scale and complexity of these structures fostered innovation in construction methods and materials. The Church provided the vision, the funding, and the continuous demand for such skilled labor, essentially sponsoring generations of engineers and artisans. Beyond stone and glass, the Church also fostered scientific learning through its direct needs. The accurate calculation of the date of Easter, for example, was a critical theological and liturgical requirement. This seemingly simple task demanded sophisticated astronomical knowledge and precise calendrical calculations. Church scholars, therefore, had a direct practical incentive to study the movements of celestial bodies. Monasteries often had sundials and even rudimentary astronomical instruments, and texts on the computus, the art of calculating ecclesiastical dates, were widely studied and developed. This practical need for calendrical astronomy stimulated observations, calculations, and the preservation of ancient astronomical texts. Church also ran many of the early hospitals and infirmaries, often attached to monasteries or cathedrals. While medieval medicine had its limitations, these institutions were where medical knowledge was collected, copied, and practiced. Monks and nuns often served as healers, and medical texts were among those painstakingly preserved in monastic libraries. This practical engagement with health and healing, driven by Christian charity, meant that the Church directly supported a significant portion of early medical learning and practice. Furthermore, many individual scholars received direct financial support or positions within the Church. Roger Bacon, a 13th-century Franciscan friar, often lauded for his emphasis on observation and experimental science, was very much a part of the ecclesiastical intellectual world. While his ideas sometimes brought him into conflict with church authorities, he was a product of the university system, which was very much a church creation. Many intellectual figures were clerics, bishops, or abbots, and their positions provided them with the leisure, resources, and access to texts necessary for their scholarly work. They were able to pursue studies in optics, alchemy, or other fields because their daily needs were met by the Church. The vast land holdings and income of the Church allowed it to commission countless illuminated manuscripts. These were not just decorative items. They were often meticulously illustrated copies of important texts, requiring immense artistic and technical skill. Patronage of manuscript production kept alive traditions of drawing, painting, and calligraphy through centuries. It also meant that skilled artists and artisans found steady employment and a platform for developing their crafts. Even the development of mechanical clocks in the 13th century, often found in grand cathedrals, indicates the Church's role in technological advancement. These sophisticated devices, necessary for regulating monastic routines and liturgical times, were early examples of complex machinery and precision engineering, again funded and maintained by ecclesiastical institution. The Church's pervasive presence and its immense wealth meant that it was not just a religious institution, but also a massive economic and cultural force, constantly commissioning, funding, and indirectly fostering a wide array of learning, from the highest theological debates to the practicalities of building and timekeeping. This continuous patronage ensured that intellectual and artistic pursuits had a stable and powerful benefactor through centuries of change. Number 5. Latin became the universal language of learning. As the Roman Empire dissolved, the Latin language, once common across a vast territory, began to transform. In different regions, local dialects evolved into what would eventually become the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, the linguistic unity of Europe, Fragante. But in this era of linguistic divergence, one institution held firm to Latin, not just as a sacred language for its rituals, but as the essential medium for all serious scholarship and communication: the medieval Church. This deliberate decision and consistent practice meant that Latin became the universal language of learning, a powerful force that unified the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe and directly shaped how knowledge was created, disseminated, and preserved. Think about a scholar from Oxford, an aspiring theologian from Paris, and a law student from Bologna. Despite speaking different vernaculars in their daily lives, they could all attend the same lectures, read the same books, and engage in vigorous debates using Latin. This shared language transcended geographical and political boundaries, created a single, interconnected intellectual community across the entire continent. A master from England could teach in Germany, A student from Italy could study in France, and their shared academic experience was seamless because Latin served as the common ground. Without this linguistic uniformity, the vibrant exchange of ideas and scholars that characterized the medieval universities would have been impossible. The Church was the primary institution that preserved and actively taught Latin. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and later universities all used Latin as the sole language of instruction. Children destined for the clergy were taught Latin from a young age, often through rigorous grammar exercises and memorization of classical texts. This ensured a continuous supply of literate individuals capable of engaging with the sophisticated intellectual discourse of the time. The very act of learning Latin meant engaging with a complex grammatical structure and a rich vocabulary which, in itself, was an intellectual discipline. Latin was also the language of all official church documents, papal bulls, conciliar decrees, theological treatises, and liturgical texts. The Vulgate Bible, St. Jerome's Latin translation, was the authoritative version used throughout Western Christendom for centuries. This constant exposure to and reliance upon Latin in religious life reinforced its status as the language of authority and profound thought. This wasn't just about reading. It was about thinking in Latin, composing in Latin, and arguing in Latin. It was a language of precision capable of expressing complex philosophical and theological nuances. The vast majority of classical Roman texts that survived the early medieval period were written in Latin. By maintaining Latin as the language of scholarship, the Church ensured that these ancient works, filled with philosophy, history, and scientific knowledge, remained accessible to scholars. If European learning had abandoned Latin entirely, much of that classical heritage would have become opaque, requiring extensive translation efforts before it could be studied. The continuity of Latin meant that the intellectual tradition stretched back to antiquity without a significant linguistic break. Furthermore, the continuous use of Latin meant the constant creation of new Latin texts throughout the Middle Ages. Scholars composed original works in Latin, adding to the vast body of philosophical, theological, legal, and scientific literature. This dynamic use of the language meant it evolved to accommodate new concepts and ideas, remaining a living, breathing vehicle for intellectual exploration. The impact of this linguistic unity was profound. It fostered a sense of shared intellectual heritage across Europe, facilitating the movement of people and ideas, and providing a stable common framework for all serious academic endeavor. The Church's unwavering commitment to Latin ensured that Europe's intellectual discourse had a common tongue, a singular voice that allowed for a level of coherence and collaboration that might otherwise have been unattainable. Number 4. The Church provided a moral and ethical framework for inquiry. In the medieval world, the pursuit of knowledge was rarely seen as an abstract, detached activity. Instead, it was deeply intertwined with questions of morality, ethics, and ultimate truth. Church, as the dominant moral and spiritual authority, provided the overarching framework within which all intellectual inquiry took place. This meant that the search for knowledge was not merely about discovering facts, but about understanding divine order, serving God, and contributing to the salvation of humanity. This ethical lens profoundly shaped what questions were asked, how they were pursued, and what kinds of knowledge were considered valuable or dangerous. Think about the concept of truth itself. For medieval scholars, truth was ultimately divine. All knowledge, whether about the natural world or human society, was seen as ultimately flowing from God. This perspective meant that philosophical and scientific inquiry was often understood as a way of uncovering God's handiwork in creation. Studying astronomy might reveal the celestial mechanics designed by a divine craftsman. Studying human nature might reveal the divine image within humanity. This provided a powerful motivation for inquiry, imbuing it with a sense of sacred purpose. The pursuit of knowledge was a path to understanding the divine. This framework also meant that intellectual inquiry was rarely entirely free in the modern sense. There were boundaries often debated and defined by church authorities. Questions that directly contradicted established Christian doctrine or those that seemed to lead to heresy could be condemned. However, it is crucial to understand that this was often after extensive theological debate and intellectual scrutiny, not simply arbitrary suppression. Condemnation of certain radical interpretations of Averroes' philosophy in the 13th century, for example, which suggested a single universal intellect for all humans and denied individual immortality, came after prolonged and detailed intellectual arguments within the university setting, largely led by theologians. These condemnations were not simply silencing dissent. They were often attempts to maintain the coherence of a comprehensive worldview that integrated faith and reason. The Church also emphasized the idea of scientia, true knowledge, serving sapientia, wisdom. Knowledge was valuable, but true wisdom involved understanding how that knowledge related to ultimate human flourishing and salvation. This meant that ethical considerations were always at the forefront. A scholar wasn't just accumulating facts. They were seeking a deeper understanding that would guide moral action and lead to a virtuous life. This influenced curriculum, with ethics and moral philosophy being deeply integrated into theological and legal studies. The development of canon law, the legal system of the Church, also shaped legal reasoning and ethical frameworks. Canon law dealt with marriage, property, inheritance, and moral transgressions, developing sophisticated methods of argumentation, precedent, and judicial process. This rigorous legal thinking, rooted in Christian morality, influenced the development of secular law across Europe. Jurists, whether trained in civil or canon law, were shaped by the ethical principles and systematic reasoning that permeated church legal thought. Furthermore, the Church's teachings on natural law, the idea that certain moral principles are inherent in creation and accessible through human reason, provided a universal ethical grounding for human action and governance. Scholars grappled with how to reconcile divine law with human law, and how reason could discern ethical truths in the world. This intellectual tradition fostered a deep connection between intellectual pursuit and moral responsibility. The moral framework also implied that knowledge came with responsibility. Scholars were expected to use their intellect for the common good and for the glory of God, not for selfish gain or destructive purposes. This emphasis on the purpose of knowledge, beyond mere accumulation, ensured that ethical considerations were interwoven with every aspect of learning. It established a moral compass for intellectual exploration, directing inquiry towards truths that were not only intellectually satisfying but also spiritually and ethically beneficial to the community. This continuous ethical reflection, driven by the Church, profoundly shaped the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe, establishing a legacy of inquiry that always wrestled with purpose and moral implications. Number 3. The Church established a network of schools. Before the grand universities emerged in the High Middle Ages, the foundations of European learning were being laid in a vast and often overlooked network of smaller localized schools. These were primarily monastic schools, and even more importantly, cathedral schools, all directly established, funded, and overseen by the Church. These institutions were the backbone of education, providing crucial literacy and foundational learning for centuries, shaping minds long before the idea of a university even existed in Europe. They were the training grounds for almost anyone who would go on to be literate, from future priests to royal administrators. Consider the role of cathedral schools. As dioceses became more organized, bishops were increasingly required to ensure that there were schools attached to their cathedrals. These were not just for training future clergy. They often admitted external students as well. Important cathedral schools, like those at Chartres, Lyon, Reims, and Canterbury, became renowned centers of learning. They attracted masters and students from across their regions, and sometimes even from further afield. These schools focused on the liberal arts curriculum that would later form the basis of university studies: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Learning Latin, the language of the Church, and of all serious scholarship, was central to this education. The masters in these schools were often canons or other clerics, dedicated scholars who devoted their lives to teaching. They lectured on classical authors, philosophical texts, and the fundamentals of Christian doctrine. They taught students how to read, write, and engage in basic argumentation. These schools were essential for producing not only priests and monks, but also the literate administrators, notaries, and legal clerks needed to run increasingly complex secular governance and commercial enterprises. Church, in its own organizational needs, demanded a steady supply of literate individuals, and its schools directly met this demand. Monastic schools also played a significant, though often more internally focused role. While some monastic schools were open to external students, their primary purpose was often the education of oblates, children dedicated to monastic life, and new recruits. They focused on spiritual formation, the study of scripture, and the preservation and copying of texts in their scriptoria. These schools maintained a high level of literacy and scholarly activity within their communities, serving as vital cultural and intellectual reservoirs. However, it was the cathedral schools, with their more public and outward-looking mission, that truly served as the primary drivers of widespread foundational education. The Church's commitment to education was not merely a passive acceptance. It actively promoted and even mandated the establishment of schools. For instance, the Third Lateran Council in 1179 decreed that every cathedral should have a master who taught for free to poor scholars, ensuring that a basic level of education was accessible. This was a radical idea for its time, demonstrating the Church's belief in the value of knowledge and its role in society. These schools prepared students for higher learning, with many eventually moving on to the burgeoning universities. The intellectual ferment that led to the creation of universities often originated in the advanced teaching and scholarly reputation of these very cathedral schools. The widespread nature of these schools meant that even in remote regions, there was usually some access to basic education, however limited. While mass literacy as we understand it today was still centuries away, the Church's network of schools ensured that there was a consistent, albeit relatively small, stream of literate individuals emerging from society. These individuals were capable of reading, writing, and engaging with the complex intellectual traditions that the Church championed. Continuous operation of these schools, from the early Middle Ages through to the rise of universities, demonstrates the Church's enduring role as the primary educational institution in Europe, shaping generations of scholars and administrators. Number 2. The Church pioneered new educational methods. Medieval learning was not just about what was taught, it was profoundly shaped by how it was taught. The Church, particularly through the development of cathedral schools and later universities, pioneered and refined innovative educational methods that continue to influence how we learn today. These methods, designed for rigorous intellectual engagement and the systematic organization of knowledge, became the bedrock of academic instruction across Europe, moving beyond simple memorization to cultivate analytical and critical thinking skills. One of the most fundamental methods was the lectio, or lecture. This involved a master reading aloud from an authoritative text, such as a passage from the Bible, Aristotle, or a legal code. But it wasn't just a reading. The master would then provide extensive commentary, explaining difficult passages, clarifying terminology, and drawing connections to other related texts. Students would often take notes, sometimes dictating to scribes, creating their own copies of the lecture material. This method ensured that students had access to important texts which were often scarce and expensive, and provided expert guidance in interpreting complex ideas. It fostered a deep engagement with authoritative sources and their systematic exposition. However, the lectio was only one part of the intellectual process. The disputatio, or disputation, was arguably even more central to medieval learning, especially in the universities. This was a formalized public debate on a specific quaestio or question. A master would propose a question, and students or other scholars would argue for or against it, presenting objections and responses. The master would moderate, guide the arguments, and ultimately provide a definitive resolution. Imagine a live, high-stakes, intellectual sparring match where logical precision, rhetorical skill, and a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter were paramount. These disputations taught students how to construct logical arguments, how to identify flaws in reasoning, how to defend their positions, and how to anticipate counter-arguments. They were training grounds for critical thinking and rigorous analytical debate, essential for any scholar, lawyer, or theologian. The intellectual outcomes of these disputations and lectures often found their way into written form, leading to the development of new literary genres. The Summa, like Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, was a systematic compilation of knowledge organized around questions, objections, and resolutions, directly reflecting the disputation method. Commentaries on authoritative texts also became a pervasive form of scholarly writing, where masters would provide detailed analysis and interpretation of key works, expanding on the lecture tradition. These written forms solidified the knowledge debated orally, making it accessible to a wider audience and preserving it for future generations. Another key method was the reliance on auctoritates, or authorities. Learning involved mastering a body of established knowledge from respected sources. This meant a deep engagement with classical philosophers like Aristotle, Roman jurists, and the Church Fathers. While students were expected to understand and respect these authorities, the scholastic method, particularly through disputation, also encouraged critical examination and the reconciliation of conflicting authoritative statements. It was about discerning truth through reasoned engagement with established wisdom. The oral tradition of teaching, through lectures and disputations, meant that memory and rhetorical skills were highly valued. Students were expected to internalize vast amounts of information and be able to articulate their arguments clearly and persuasively. The development of these methods within the Church's educational institutions ensured that medieval learning was dynamic and interactive, moving beyond mere rote learning to a sophisticated form of intellectual engagement. It was a rigorous, highly structured approach to knowledge that trained generations of scholars in the arts of logic, argumentation, and systematic inquiry, shaping the very intellectual sukkot that would be used for centuries to come. Number 1. The Church fostered a gradual increase in literacy. While mass literacy, as we know it today, is a relatively recent phenomenon, the medieval Church played an undeniable and continuous role in fostering a gradual, albeit limited, increase in literacy across Europe. Its own operational needs, its missionary efforts, and its administrative structures created a constant demand for literate individuals, pushing more people beyond just a tiny elite towards reading and writing. This demand directly shaped educational opportunities and the spread of written communication. Consider the sheer internal needs of the Church itself. It required a vast number of literate clergy, from humble parish priests who needed to read the liturgy and sermons, to highly educated bishops and theologians who engaged with complex Latin texts. Every priest had to be able to read the Bible, say Mass from a missal, and administer the sacraments according to written rubrics. This created an enormous internal demand for basic and advanced literacy. Monasteries, with their scriptoria and libraries, were self-contained centers of literacy, requiring monks to be able to read and copy texts. The simple need to run such a vast and complex organization, stretching across continents, necessitated a continuous supply of literate individuals. Beyond the clergy, the Church also fostered literacy among its administrators and legal professionals. The development of canon law, the Church's own legal system, required educated lawyers, notaries, and clerks to draft documents, maintain records, and conduct legal proceedings. Many individuals who served in these capacities were trained in church schools and possessed high levels of literacy in Latin. These skills were directly transferable to secular administration, and many literate individuals who served in royal chanceries or urban governments often had their foundational education in church-affiliated institutions. The increasing complexity of society in the High Middle Ages, with the growth of towns, trade, and more sophisticated governance, also created a demand for written records, charters, wills, commercial contracts, and tax documents. While secular authorities certainly needed literate individuals, the Church's long-standing tradition of literacy, its schools, and its pool of educated clergy often served as the primary source for such skills. Church-trained individuals filled many of these emerging roles in secular society, thereby spreading literacy and administrative expertise beyond purely ecclesiastical context. Furthermore, the Church, through its missionary work and the widespread veneration of saints, indirectly spurred some vernacular literacy. While sermons were delivered orally, the need to prepare them and the desire of some lay people to read lives of saints or devotional texts in their own language led to the slow development of written vernaculars. Though still limited, this was a step towards a broader literate public, driven by religious devotion. Creation of prayer books and devotional texts in local languages, often encouraged by pious clerics, offered avenues for individuals outside the traditional Latin-educated elite to engage with the written word. Churches' schools, from the smallest parish schools, teaching basic elements to the grand cathedral schools providing advanced instruction, were the primary avenues for acquiring literacy. These institutions, sustained by the Church, ensured that knowledge of reading and writing, however restricted, was maintained and gradually disseminated. Church's constant need for literate personnel, its role in legal and administrative matters, and its indirect influence on vernacular religious practice all contributed to a steady, if slow, increase in the number of people who could read and write. This persistent cultivation of literacy, rooted deeply in the Church's structure and mission, was a silent but powerful force in shaping European intellectual and social development.